My name is Jason.
My name is Tom.
And this is Fear of a Black Dragon, an old-school RPG podcast.
And in this episode, we trek from terraced plantations up into icy, breathless peaks as we return to Yoon-Suin, the Purple Land.
Our first segment is a basic crawl, so we are back with part 2 of our Yoon-Suin series, I guess we're calling it. Just some quick refreshers about Yoon-Suin. It is a setting book written by David McGrogan and features art by Matthew Adams. In the first episode, we covered roughly the first 140 pages plus some appendices in the backs related to opium and tea, all of the stuff associated with the Yellow City portion of the setting. For this episode, we are basically talking about page 141 onwards. That starts with La Hague and the 100 Kingdoms, which is one of the major regions of Yoon-Suin. The 100 Kingdoms are a patchwork of city-states. This is directly from the text. The PCs might become involved in the problems and internal strife in a single polity, or travel from place to place, each time finding a unique set of problems and solutions. They might use the 100 Kingdoms as a base for the exploration of the jungles, sinkholes, and hidden places of La Hague. You then have a number of sections that help you kind of build out the 100 Kingdoms. There is a section for generating the starting polity, which includes some basics about the polity, some issues and assets, more on that later, flavor elements, things like that. There is a section for generating the PC social circle, which includes their group type, a conflict source, a rival type. There is the random 100 Kingdoms personages, which is a fun table. General rumors and hooks, random locations and encounters, rural areas are detailed, and from page 184 to 187 you get some sample hex contents. That's for the 100 Kingdoms. For the La Hague portion, La Hague is like a deep and mysterious jungle that sort of is kind of like in front of the 100 Kingdoms, or sort of surrounds it, right? You sort of like go through La Hague from the Yellow City and that area and kind of lead out into the 100 Kingdoms. Deep and mysterious jungle features the Ghosts of La Hague random tables, adventuring in La Hague, and 30 sample locations.
The next section then brings us on to another discrete part of the setting, which is Lamorak and its neighbouring region Lower Druk-Yul, which are described as prime locations for wilderness-based campaigns of exploration, travel, and trade. Lamorak is the more populated of the two. It's a flooded land dominated by boat tribes who build floating villages and towns. It's where the God River, the major waterway of the setting that flows down to the Yellow City and is the central artery of trade within Yoon-Suin, where that river and its tributaries periodically break their banks and soak the land, kind of Okavango Delta sort of look. And then Lower Druk-Yul is, and I quote, a great and empty land without civilization or agriculture or human settlement. It is roamed by grasshopper men tribes, forgotten exiles, hidden cults, and spirits of rage and desolation. Its enumerated sections for helping you to generate your subsetting, if you will, are generating a boat tribe, Lamorak Lairs, a section of sample already worked out Lamorak hex contents, and then Lower Druk-Yul Lairs and sample hex contents for that region as well. So kind of a parallel structure for the two complementary settings. And then onwards and literally upwards to Sugd and the Mountains of the Moon. So the Mountains of the Moon are the roof of the world, a kind of pseudo-Himalayan setting. Up here in the high peaks are abandoned, haunted citadels of the dwarfs and the yak men who make the wind itself their ally. And indeed, it says their realm, although exactly what that means remains unclear at this time. Below that, in the foothills, there's the agriculturally fertile and rich land of Sugd, which is divided into plantations for tea and opium, owned by wealthy families who guard their livelihoods jealously. Their fields are patrolled by not only their slaves, but also the giant insects that they domesticate, while their slaves toil in the heat of the sun. The sections here are generating the starting oligarchy, the PC social circle. So again, similar to what we've had before, but then the tables here give you quite differently flavoured types of mini community that the PCs will either be part of or interact with. Oligarchy's personages, again, same structure but very different content. General rumours and hooks, random locations and encounters. rural and wilderness areas surrounding the oligarchies, and then sample hex contents.
And the book wraps up with the fabulous appendices. There are a number of them going down the list here. There are poisons, opium, specialist tea, trade, psionics, fortune-telling, a list of suggested traditional monsters found in Yoon-Suin, the Yellow City trade tongue and other languages, random ruin, lair, and dungeon generation, useful worms, arachnids, and insects, magical tattoos, hirelings, deities, and a section, an appendix N of inspiration. There are also, at the very end of the book, there are maps as well. So, Tom, why don't we talk about our respective experience with this portion of the Yoon-Suin book? Mine is fairly limited. I have not yet run anything using these materials apart from the odd thing here or there that I've kind of grabbed for something else. However, while I was reading through it, I was reminded that I have actually played in a session of a game called Chaos Monks, which I believe was a mashup of I can't remember what systems or what was mashed up for this, but anyway, it was run by Andrew Shields. It was a series he called Chaos Monks, and he used stuff from the Mountains of the Moon portion of the book. When I was reading it, I was like, this Jade Baths. Yeah, the Jade Baths seems awfully familiar. Oh, that's because I've done this. And so, yeah, there were several things that I recognized from it. So I have played in this a little bit.
Cool. Well, I've the one bit I haven't used directly is Lower Druk Yule, although an Ogre Mage trader did show up with some Grasshopper men as his bodyguard, so that was about it tangentially. Lamarak also made a cameo appearance as a place for people to flee to from the Yellow City when they got busted knocking over a shipping route. But mainly what I did with that was, and I think this is one of the best things about the way the book is structured into loads of different individual tables, is that my longer running Yoon-Suin campaign actually took place in an archipelago off to the south of the Yellow City. So when the player characters were gadding about in their ship, or frequently purloined ships, plural, I would just grab something normally from Lamarak because it's kind of boaty and nautical, and use that as, you know, the central feature of whatever island they pitched up at. And then, because I have this podcast I have to do, I realised that I probably should get around to running something in the 100 Kingdoms of La Hague and the Mountains of the Moon. So I did that on purpose. I ran 2 adventures, one travelling from La Hague to randomish polity over in the plains, and then one where the player characters were on a quest to discover the lost city of Sirdaria. Wait, or is it Sirdera? I always get that wrong. Anyway, you know, the fabulous lost city up in the mountains. And what I would say overall about that is that I found it remarkable how different the experiences were in each case. Like, if you flip through the book, like looking at the presentation of the tables, you would be forgiven for thinking, well, this is all going to kind of come out the same in the wash, but it doesn't.
It looks like it all runs together, doesn't it? Yeah.
And like nothing is dreadfully out of place. Like the 100 Kingdoms feel like they belong in the same setting as the Yellow City, but they feel different.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's actually a pretty good segue into the next section, which is things we liked about this portion of the book. So I'll kick us off. So in part 1 of Yoon-Suin, for Fear of a Black Dragon, we spent a good portion of this section just effusively praising the book and slobbering all over it and how much we loved it. That's not going to be any different right now.
I thought you were gearing up for a mid-review turnaround, but no.
No. I've still fucking loved this book. I love this book so much. These sections of the book, now mind you, I haven't used them in this way yet, but these sections of the book, they have a beautiful, like, grab and go quality to them. David, the author, his writing style manages to be both very evocative, but also very direct. Like it has a spareness and a directness that I really love. He does not waste your time, right? Like the sample hex contents and sample locations that are sprinkled throughout, for example, they contain just enough information for you to kind of grab them and spin them out into like an entire scene or session. Like I could totally imagine like how it's going to play out at the table, but just with these very simple, direct descriptions, you know. We talked a little bit about the polities in the 100 Kingdoms and the Mountains of the Moon. And we mentioned very briefly in the beginning this idea of issues and assets, which are special sections in those parts of the book that describe issues that a community might be faced with, or assets such as big temples or large artifacts or something that are a central feature of a community. These are such great portions of the book because basically they're fantastic little packages of information surrounding a particular trouble or a conflict or a thing that the polity is dealing with. Each of them includes an overview of the problem, a bundle of potential NPCs, some story hooks, and often some objects or things or sort of sights and sounds that you can kind of airdrop in as you need. But what's great is each of them is less than a quarter of a page long. They're quite brief, but they contain so much inspiration and so much information. Just love it. If I can, real quick, Tom, I'd like to just give an example of one of these issues in one of the polities. I think this is for La Hague, but I could be wrong. So this issue is called the Rakosh Insinuation. Rakosh is a sort of like demon, like a animal demon thing, right? It has a personality. So there's a little setup. One or several major Rakosh have inveigled themselves into the city to undermine it from within and feed on the suffering which ensues. Now we have some NPCs. A Rakosh disguised as a whore, building an army of zombie-like slaves from her patrons who spread the disease further. A Rakosh who has removed a prominent member of the elite and replaced him or her. The disguise is perfect. A Rakosh who ferments jealousy, sexual proclivity, and self-disgust wherever it goes. A holy man who knows the truth. A friend of the PCs who has suspicions something is terribly amiss. A savant child who can feel the presence of evil spirits. Then you have some hooks. A strange rabies-like disease is spreading through the city's slums. Women and men alike are engaging in wanton public depravity throughout the city. The city is preparing for war on its immediate neighbor. So there we have 3 really solid hooks to get the PCs in. And then we have some things. Mobs of frenzied citizens roaming the nighttime streets. Knife fights over women or men. Suicides and self-immolations. So here in just a couple of paragraphs, and in the amount of time it took me to read it on the air here, it's just dense with possibility, right, Tom?
Yes, it's dense with possibility, but it's also easy to very quickly get the gist of it. Like, you can scan these pages and decide what you want to do next almost immediately. A lot of things that are packed full like this, I mean, we've seen older modules like, Keep on the Borderlands. No one would argue that's not dense, but it's a little tricky to run your eyes across the page and figure out what you want to kind of pick out of it, right?
Right, yeah, and I think that speaks to one of the strengths of the book overall, which it has that quality, like I said earlier, that grab-and-go quality. There's a lot of information, there's a lot of texture, but it's presented in a way that you can, you can just grab it and do what you will with it. You don't have to spend a lot of time reading a bunch of stuff, right, to get your inspiration.
Yeah, and you can just throw in a detail occasionally that you've gleaned from a page, and it doesn't have to be a big thing, but it all adds up into building the setting through incidental details, which I think is great as well. Which actually brings me on to something I'd like to mention that I really like about this section in particular, I think even more so than the Yellow City, which of course is dominated by alien slug people and therefore is not the grittiest part of the book. But there's a great combination of the fantastical and the mundane at work, especially I would say around the 100 Kingdoms and the Mountains of the Moon sections. And what it kind of reminds me of. Yeah, and the reason for that is because of the sort of the real richness. It's a melting pot setting, much like its real-world inspirations. It's the kind of place where it's easy to be, for a player character, to be from somewhere weird, but also very easily a part of the setting, because you just came from somewhere a few mountains over, you're an outsider, but, nobody freaks out or thinks you're particularly odd, necessarily. And when I was at university, this is going somewhere, we had a guest lecturer for 1 or 2 classes. This was when I was, doing ethnomusicology. And he was a Gurung shaman from Nepal. The Gurung are people who, they live in a couple of particular locations within Nepal, but I think they're sort of found throughout the place. And he showed up he was the sort of guy who would do things like, because he was speaking English and is basically the parish priest, but is a shaman, he would kind of talk about his work in the language of a Church of England vicar. So he'd say something like, yeah, I've got some slides here. I'll just show you a picture of my parish. And he flicks to the next slide, and it's a massive, breathtaking vista of about 8 mountain peaks. And you go, okay. And he, one of the lessons he kind of came in, he's sort of wearing the clothes he wears to, do his work and travel from village to village and deal with the spirits. And, he told us like how to make a ritual drum. You need a piece of wood that's been struck by lightning and the pelt of a leopard, FYI. And at one point...
Good to know, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this could be handy. You never know when that could save your life. And obviously we were all kind of quite young university students at a very hippie sort of college. And one of the fellow students got quite excited and was sort of asking about, what about the hood on the robe there? Is that like just a hood, or is it also a bag? He goes, oh yeah, it's like a bag. You can keep things in it. She goes, well, what do you keep in that? Is that like for ritual ingredients? And he said, yes. Also my sandwiches. And so that I think is kind of a lot of what's going on in Yoon-Suin, this sort of esoteric, very colourful and often baffling, even to people that live within the setting, things right alongside the day-to-day business of growing, harvesting and consuming tea and opium, doing the washing and going to sleep at night, all that kind of stuff. And I think it's very well evoked and quite efficiently, as you mentioned.
Yeah, I agree. That is one of that play between the mundane and the fantastical is one of the things that makes this a really, really great book. I think it's one of the things that makes it just a smidge superior to, say, Kelong, which we talked about in another episode, because Kelong really focuses on that like fantastical god war, right, and the fallout from it. Yoon-Suin, these sections of Yoon-Suin have a lot of similar flavor to Kelong, but there's a pastoral quality to it as well, right, that I think comes out just a little bit sharper. Another one of those interesting sort of dichotomies in this book that I really appreciated is between rural and urban, right? Like that is an interesting dichotomy that takes place throughout this section of the book. Like in fact, each of the three major regions are presented like that, right? There's the rural part and then there's the urban part, right? And I like that as well. Another thing that really appealed to me about this section, just a few more little notes. The 100 Kingdoms is a very particular type of fantasy setting that I love. The great walled city-state, right? You might think of something like in Conan or the eastern lands that Daenerys Targaryen roams around in A Song of Ice and Fire and Game of Thrones. Even if you're not playing in Yoon-Suin, the tables, issues, assets, and all that stuff to form one of the 100 Kingdoms would be very helpful for creating such a city-state in some other setting.
Yeah, that's literally true in my case. I ran a game set in Shakespearean Verona, which I pilfered from the 100 Kingdoms for. There's also, though, there's a great desolate mystery city, which is my favourite thing, probably in the whole of this section, which is also one of the great mysteries as outlined in the very beginning of the book, Sir Daria. Formerly a normal city, now it's inhabited by mysterious ogre mages from outside. And there's this whole thing with the original human inhabitants were sort of chopped in half and they now hop around on one leg. They're only half, literally 50% people. And there's a powerful demon running the place called the Shik that no one knows anything about. And in fact, these are, the Nasnas and the Shik originate from, 1001 Nights, that kind of Persian, maybe Arabian mythology. And so that's a very interesting use of something that's literally from outside. Like these are perceived as strange outsiders that nobody understands. And that's a very good use of being literal, I think. And they just have a wonderfully kind of cold and melancholy quality to them that is quite at odds with the rest of the setting. And that's why I think it works really well.
I'm also going to point out throughout the text, there's like a really terrific sense of horror taking place, right? This part of the text versus the Yellow City part has a lot of like just outright horrific things. Like a lot of the examples and stuff are just really like kind of gruesome, scary stuff. I was reminded of like, some of those terrible like torture scenes in like, POW movies or whatever, right? Like movies about Vietnam or whatever. And it had that kind of feeling, but like in a sort of fantastical way, right? Like these demons, the Bishaka, who dip their enemies or their captives in tar and create tar statues out of them.
Yeah.
And if you find one of these tar statues, the person who was dipped in it might still be alive, right? Like that kind of thing. Just really, really gruesome stuff.
Oh yeah, I love that. I wanted to use that in one of my adventures, but then it would have to be a side thing. I thought there's no way that anyone's going to find this and then just move on within like 10 minutes.
Right,
so
exactly.
I had to leave it. That's a whole adventure by itself.
And I guess the last thing that I would call out is just something I loved about the book are the appendices. They are so handy. I can imagine using them in all kinds of different contexts, not just Yoon-Suin.
Yeah. The only one I'm not excited about is the ordinary monsters from other fantasy games because, whatever.
Oh, I like that. You didn't like that?
No, I don't. Well, I don't care. I don't come to Yoon-Suin for orcs. Come on, man. But
well, I don't think orcs are an option. But are they?
You know what I mean. But magical tattoos, definitely poisons, for sure. It's all really good.
Well, let's move on to questions we have about this part of the book, and I have a few. I'm confused about the sample hex contents versus sample locations. It's probably because I don't run hex crawls, but I'm having a hard time figuring out what the distinction was in those two different parts. For each region, this is included for each region. There's sample hex contents, which have some descriptive things, and sample locations. What's the difference there, Tom?
Yeah, okay. I don't think this is a thing that you don't get because of the hex crawl barrier. I think this is not like a systematic thing. But in this case, it seems to be that the sample hex contents are, for example, in the 100 Kingdoms, it's what's in the whole hex, right? This is the entire content. Whereas the La Hague adventuring system, as you'll recall, has like you find one location and you can go searching for other locations in the same hex. Right. So it's like a finer grading of
I
things.
see. It's like zoomed out, zoomed in.
I think so. Yeah. I mean,
okay.
Yeah.
All right. Good. That's, yeah. I just wanted that cleared up when I was reading through it. I didn't get it. Well, just to piggyback off that a little bit, we are told in each of the hex for the La Hague hex crawl, we're told that each has an obvious location and 3 or more hidden locations, and that players can search and find the hidden ones. As a GM, would you tell your players about the existence of the hidden ones, Tom?
Yes, I would. Or at least I would tell them that you can, searching for more locations is a thing you can do, because I've tried we all want it to be kind of seamless and organic, like, we're painting such a luxuriant picture of the world, it's all going to go great. They do what their characters would do. But the fact is, if players don't really know that that's a practical option, I mean, they won't say, I'll search the jungle for more stuff. Like, you've got to say that it's at least a possibility. I think in this case, there's 3 or more. I would definitely say you can look for more stuff. And then when they start to run dry and finding more locations, that's when they know they've exhausted the hex, I would think.
Well, I guess the push-pull there is you're supposed to also roll random encounters as they do that, right? So the more time they spend there, the more danger, I guess, they summon. But yeah. My last question I had is a subjective one, but it kept rattling around in my head the entire time I was reading the text, which is, would the book be better or worse if it contained a lot of detailed art? You might recall from part 1, that was one of the things we dinged the book for, which was the lack of art. But I was reading through it and I was thinking, would it be better or worse? Like, would detailed art kind of mess up something?
Oh, well, it's because you've thrown in the word detailed there that I feel like I have an escape clause. Because I think that more art in the current style, or like in that sort of, especially the landscapey ones where trees are circles over the top of a couple of lines and stuff, where there's kind of room for your imagination to fill in the gaps. I think that would be great. I would have at least another 25% of what we have now. But detailed, I don't know. That for me, that would end up being, if it looks exactly like it's the way I imagine it, then yes. Otherwise, no. Which of course is a fool's errand.
I was imagining like, a sort of like 7th C version of Yoon-Suin.
No. Okay, wait. Okay, no.
All right, fair enough. I think I tend to agree. I think what makes Yoon-Suin so appealing to me is it's very evocative. It manages to be very evocative with minimal language and no art, right? And I think that speaks to a great strength of it. So I tend to believe that very detailed art would probably ruin something.
Although, having said that, and this should maybe go in Companion Adventures, except I'll forget if we wait until the end of the episode, someone did post on Google Plus a bunch of computer-generated 3D art they'd done inspired by Yoon-Suin that's like photorealistic, and it's really cool.
I remember that. Yeah, I remember that. Maybe we'll find the link for the show notes.
It doesn't look like anything I imagined either, but I looked at it and I thought, yeah, it's pretty good. So, yeah.
Yeah, we might put a link in the show notes if we can find it again. All right, chain lightning round. Tom, fire off. You go first.
Okay, I'll do one of those things. Yes, so number 1, the Buta and the Mute Drifts. They are little blue kind of snow pixie people who always surprise you in a snowy environment, hide in frosty, foggy clouds, and shoot you with little arrows. They're kind of feeble, but they always surprise you. So, And a tribe of them live in this location called the Mute Drifts, which is an eerily silent, snow-covered valley way up high in the mountains, with the rather disturbing find you can make there of 2d6 children encased in ice ready for, I think, eating later. But just the idea of this deathly still valley that is a death trap. Brilliant.
I'm going to say the Pool of the Psionic Octopodes, which is one of the things you can find in La Hague. I love it because it's suggestive of mind flayers, because these octopoid creatures can psi-blast you, basically. It's suggestive of mind flayers in a typical, Eurocentric D&D setting, but like a sort of little-known genetic offshoot of mind flayers over in Yoon-Suin. Along those same lines, there's in Lower Drukgyul, there's an amethyst medusa, which is a medusa as we know it, except she has, or he, I suppose, has centipedes for hair instead of snakes, and their gaze turns you into amethyst instead of stone. I love these details because they're suggestive of Yoon-Suin being a different place, but sort of evolutionarily, ecologically still part of the same world as other parts of your fantasy world, right? Much in the same way that we get like sort of variations of animals on different continents, right?
Cool. My number 2 is one of the sample locations that's given in La Hague, which is where you find a bunch of fat, fleshy maggots dangling from a tree, and inside them are these people that were cursed by Sone witches to be shrunk and then just trapped inside these maggots. It's disgusting. I used it in my game. In fact, all of my chain lightnings are, for the sake of authenticity, things that I used. And RPCs sort of cut them out and set them free, except they also kind of put them into indentured servitude for like the next 3 weeks. So, a mixed benefit.
I'm going to go with the table for generating a Lamorak boat tribe. Most books, I feel, would have said they are people who live on boats. They fish, they trade, but not here. These tables that you can end up with some very culturally distinct people who sort of gather together on boats. And I just love it. For example, one of the details is these boat people shove stones in their cheeks and throat in order to stretch them out so they can make bullfrog-like, ululations noises, right?
I also like the Pagicot, which are these mute but mournful spider things with a cluster of human eyes in the center of their heads and human hands on the end of each leg. They are messed up and creepy.
And my last one is the rhinoceros beetle god Gendabitala and her followers. So this is a big rhino beetle, the size of a house, in the middle of this village. And the people who live there feed it fruit. They feed it basically everything they can find. They keep themselves on the verge of starvation because they believe this rhino beetle is a god. They believe if you touch the horn of this rhino beetle of Gentabitala, you will get the answer to a question. But every time they do it, they get sick. And so it's just such a grim portrait of this huge beetle out in the middle of, the jungle or wherever with these sad people filled with questions who are very hungry. Let's go to the Expert Delve. It's the Expert Delve. We have a 2-part Expert Delve. Tom, what do you want to talk about?
I want to talk about the lessons I've learnt from running stuff in Yoon-Suin. And that's specifically that I think there are 2 kind of approaches you can take to Yoon-Suin, as with anything. One of them is to try and use the book as it's sort of implied that you're supposed to, right? So to create things that could only happen in Yoon-Suin, to run a hex crawl or point crawl that you just create using the tables in the book, and that's your adventure in its entirety. Then the second option is to take kind of maybe not a pre-existing scenario or adventure, maybe something you would invent yourself, but that is a bit more generic. And of course, there's nothing wrong with that. We've talked before about how it's pretty nice if things only work in the setting they're in. So Secret of Castronega, we talked about how it was good that it played off where it was set and when. But not everything has to be like that. And, Fistful of Dollars, quite a good movie, but also a remake of Yojimbo. And equally, Akira Kurosawa's Macbeth, pretty good film. But Macbeth, you'll be surprised to learn, was not originally set in Edo period Japan. So you can do that. But what I found was, looking at my most recent 2 adventures. One of them used a pre-existing scenario, Mistaken Identity for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. Good scenario, it all went well, but there are things to take into account. One is that Yoon-Suin, as a setting, brings out the best in players, and by that I mean their tendency to lounge around the place in silk dressing gowns, smoke opium, and generally faff about doing all kinds of nonsense. So It's important to budget extra time into your sessions for that kind of thing.
I will confirm. In my Yellow City campaign that I ran, that is largely what they spent their time doing.
Yeah, so I would say as a rule of thumb, I would say that like if you've got what you think is a 2-session scenario, make it a 3-session scenario, and like there's 1 session's worth of time spread across those, which is going to be taken up, just bartering with merchants, engaging in witty repartee with like some random household guard, discussing which pleasure house or baths to go to next, that kind of stuff.
It's like I'm just imagining like this sort of like classic like like Eurotrash traveler in Asia, like doing their thing or whatever, and like I don't know, it's the adventuring version of that, and I'm kind of living for it. So
it was a lot like that. I had a party consisting of a crab person, a slug noble wizard who was basically like a slightly American version of all characters played by Matt Berry, which I'll send you a YouTube link, and played by Horse, a quite disturbing savage warrior. She would literally wear the bloodied ears of her enemies as a necklace, and people would keep going, "Is she wearing an ear necklace?" And they'd be like, "Yeah." So yeah, that's the other thing. Yoon-Suin seems to bring out quite odd character types compared to your bog standard fighter, thief, wizard gang. So yeah. Anyway. All right. On to more practical things. I would say that in terms of making a standard-ish fantasy adventure seem Yoon-Suin-y, little details go quite a long way. So just kind of look up some different kinds of food on Wikipedia before you start the session to mention that that's what's on sale at the inn. Everyone travels around by ox cart, not by horse-drawn carriage. Yeah, and just like clothing, just always describe people wearing, saris or turbans or batiked things. And that surprisingly seems to work, even though it sounds absolutely stupid.
Well, and it actually combines up really nicely with some advice you gave last time too, when we were talking about Orientalism, right? When you talked about different ways of like making your sort of like Westernish sounding PCs or whatever, like have more of that like sort of Yoon-Suin flair. I love this sort of exercise of Yoon-Suin, right? As a GM, like there's so much space to really like stretch your creative muscles, to get into, when I ran this, I do this like little technique that I learned from Jared Sorensen, where basically for everything you encounter or every, person or place or whatever, you have 3 descriptive details that you use to kind of bring them alive, right? And I've since reincorporated that advice into my broader sort of GM prep philosophy of 731, right? But what I love about like when I was running Yellow City, and I assume it would be the same for the other portions of the Yoon-Suin book, is that 3-part, the 3 distinct details is really important here, right? Like, what do things smell like? What do things look like? What are they wearing? And I just like that. It's a challenge, right? And I think it forces us to not take anything for granted in the way we narrate things at the table. Yeah. So sorry, go ahead and continue, Tom.
Sure. So actually, for all that I'm a bit like not 100% on the idea of using generic scenarios, for want of a better term, I did find there's an interesting side effect of going along and adapting what you have, which is that I would get a printout of, what I was going to do, or actually just edit the PDF and go through and actually change the names of things. Like not all the time, I'm not insane, but like in headings and stuff, I would change the name of a city to something that was going to be in the Yoon-Suin setting, or I would copy edit it in pen. And this turned out to be a pretty good way to familiarize yourself with the scenario and its slightly complex bits, because it forces you to actually read everything that's going on. So that was a happy side effect. But for all that, I would say that I had a much better time when I did what I'm supposed to do. And I sat down and made a quite simple point crawl. You're traveling to this city. You've got little different nodes. So the first thing they had was they were ambushed by the Buta snow goblin things at a pass. Then they had kind of 3 different places they could go. So they missed out on the evil mummified monk, which is probably sensible. They also missed out on the Migo lair, also probably sensible. And then they went to one oligarchy up in the mountains, and eventually they went past a wizard's tower, and then finally to the lost city of Seodaria. And that was just like 100% Yoon-Suin, and it was much simpler to GM as well. It may not look like that much on the page, and that's definitely the criticism I see from people who've read the PDF but not really used it. But it is just like write down the things and then do the things, and it works really, really well.
It's good to know. Good to know. All right. Well, the thing I want to talk about, keeping with our theme here of Tom talks about his actual experience with the book, and I just talk about my inspiration. I found myself being, if you couldn't tell from earlier, really in love with the idea of issues and assets, and I strongly recommend to listeners you go and take a look at some of those in the book as you're listening to this, or pause it and go look, so you kind of have a better context of what I'm talking about. I love it. I got thinking about how I would approach issues and assets if I was running World of Dungeons or Dungeon World, or, spoiler alert, any OSR system, because the things I'm going to talk about would work in anything. So I'm going to talk about, just for purposes of example, I'm going to have one of the issues here. It's called The Witch Hunt. It's on page 152. Tom, would you read that for me?
Sure. Here we go. Page 152. Witch Hunt. Yes. The people of the city have become obsessed with rooting out what they believe to be malicious internal enemies or heretics, who they have been hanging, burning alive, burying alive, or forcing into exile. The NPCs are a fanatical rabble-rouser drunk on power, a gleeful executioner, a genuine internal enemy, a witch, malign magician, or heretic, an unfortunate holy man, a friend of the PCs, member of a sect deemed heretical, a kind-hearted zamindar sheltering victims. A zamindar, I will note here, is sort of local potentate. The hooks are, a zamindar is sheltering targets of the witch hunt, and they need to be helped to flee the city before a mob gathers. A friend of the PCs has been captured and is to be executed by the throng. The throng has turned its attention towards outsiders in general. And finally, things. Bodies burning in pyres, thuggish men roaming the streets in bands with machetes looking for victims, a crowd watching an execution.
So this is all fabulous. Thank you, Tom. I love it. Super evocative. The question that I'd like to answer here is, if we're running World of Dungeons or Dungeon World, how do we transform that into something that's more usable for World of Dungeons or Dungeon World? Okay, so practical stuff here. The answer, of course, is you make it into a front. A front is made up of a collection of threats or dangers in Dungeon World parlance. There's the threats, you have the description and the cast, you have custom moves if there are any, and then you have stakes. This is very much the Dungeon World way of doing it, but it would work pretty well for World of Dungeons or something similar. So description and cast is very easy. The description is given to you in the very beginning, like the first part that Tom read, that is a description. The cast is also pretty straightforward. It's basically anyone who is not a threat. We'll talk about the threats in a minute. But my read is the cast is going to be the unfortunate holy man, the friend of the PCs who's been deemed a heretic, the kind-hearted zamindar sheltering victims, possibly the gleeful executioner. I think it depends. In any case, in all cases, you would give these characters names, right? We're going to just refer to them by their title in the book, or what they're known as. But when you actually would write your front, you would give them names. I think it's helpful to give these NPCs a motivation of some sort, or ask yourself, like, what might happen if the PC encountered them, right? But we'll put a pin in that for now. We're going to talk about that in a minute. Continuing on with the basics of the front. Custom moves. Well, from the issue as written, I wouldn't say anything jumps out immediately, but I started to kind of expand my thinking a little bit as I was reading it. And it occurred to me that the central conflict is going to be who is a witch and who is not a witch. That's one possible central conflict, right? And that's the one that appeals to me. And to me, the question of who is a witch and who is not a witch, that implies a method for determining who is a witch and who is not a witch. And now we're getting close to something maybe that could be a custom move here, right? So for example, you can imagine a magical item that can make this determination. In Dungeon World especially, a magical item is just a custom move, right? It's just a custom move tied to an object. Perhaps there's some sort of book that can help you identify them, in which case the custom move might add a question to your options for Discern Realities for DW, or give you some kind of extra insight on a wisdom roll. Does that make sense, Tom?
Yeah, it does. Now, this, however, rings some alarm bells for me a little bit, and I will explain why. I'm not obviously against the idea of custom moves in general. You've seen my Google Plus feed, you know that. But there is a danger with custom moves, right? So if I was running this in World of Dungeons, I would just use Reader Person out of Apocalypse World, because I tend to use AW moves instead of DW ones anyway, and have a reason for when you ask, are you telling the truth, for the answer to be no, but it's not because they're a witch. that makes things interesting. Now, that's technically a custom move in Dungeon World because it doesn't have that move.
There is no read a person, right? Yeah.
But that then is the thing. So I think you have to be careful when as soon as you start thinking, I could do a custom move for this, are you selling the players short on the promise of the game they signed up for? There's a reason that Apocalypse World has read a person, but Dungeon World does not. And as long as you've kind of taken that step to think, that's okay in this circumstance, then fine. But, do take that step.
I have a response to that.
Yeah.
To answer that question, specificity, fictional specificity is the key, right? The custom move would be written in a very, very specific way with a very, very specific trigger so that we're just focusing on this question of figuring out who is which and who is not a witch under this particular circumstance. It wouldn't be something that you could extrapolate out to. It wouldn't be as broad as read a person, for example. It wouldn't be something that you could trigger in other places, right? To me, a good custom move is very specific. And I think that's what Dungeon World would have you do, right? The custom moves are for this. We have a really particular type of encounter or scene that is implied here. And that's what the custom move is going to help us get to.
Yeah. I mean, it wouldn't even be as specific as, detect a witch. It would be something like when you are investigating who is a witch in the village of
such and such using the XYZ method or whatever, right?
Yeah. Although that does bring me to another tone issue with custom moves, which is that, to take this particular example, I mean, I'm not an expert on witch trials, although I do know enough to know that the number of people who think Witch the Road to Lindisfarne is historically accurate in any measure is slightly distressing, although it's not even advertised that way. What's up with that? But anyway, witch trials as a venue for drama are not typically associated with actually finding out the truth. And so
that's fair. Yeah. you
may very well want a magic book to actually be the answer, to help you find the real answer, if that's the genre you're doing. But if what attracted you to the witch trial was witch trials, as in the McCarthy hearings or Salem, then maybe you don't want to do that. So again, tread carefully. And then once you've decided that is what you want to do, then yes, books, wisdom rolls, that kind of thing. Yeah.
Absolutely. Good. Very good advice. So custom moves. Fortunately, custom moves are not mandatory in a front. It's just if you need
Fortunately.
Them, right? If you need a custom move, you throw it in there. Stakes. This is pretty hard. So the way stakes work in Dungeon World is they're stakes questions, actually. I think it's the same in Apocalypse World too. But the idea is they are questions that, they're usually framed up in the sense of if character A does not do X, what will happen, right? If character B does not do thing Y, what will be the result, right? They are meant to sort of challenge player characters' motivations and sort of goad them to action or give you a reason to push them in a particular direction to see what they do, right? This can be really hard if you haven't been playing for a while to build this situation up, right? Normally when for front creation for Dungeon World, for example, you've played a session or two before you build your front, right? You've kind of had some things happen on screen. You've been asking lots of questions. You've built up some currency here, and then you make the front, right? So it all kind of feels really tightly integrated into the character story. If you are just trying to adapt a thing from the Yoon-Suin book, that buy-in is not quite there. You haven't quite earned the stakes question, so to speak. But let's put a pin in that for now because I have an answer. So we'll come back to it. We're up to 2 pins now, by my reckoning.
Okay, I've stuck them in this corkboard that is definitely real and is right here, and I will draw your attention to them later.
Please do. Threats and dangers. This is pretty easy, I think. The implied dangers are pretty straightforward here, right? The fanatical rabble-rouser, drunk on power. The genuine internal enemy, maybe a witch, right? Something like that. And again, possibly the gleeful executioner. I keep putting possibly in front of the gleeful executioner because I can see that character being maybe a one-off encounter or a sort of sardonic or dark humor kind of comedy relief NPC thing. It could, or it could be someone who is a genuine threat, but maybe the stakes are lower, right? It's a threat based off of a really particular focused, maybe they're harassing somebody in the village or something like that, right? Maybe it's not big citywide dangers going on there. So the gleeful executioner, I'm not totally sure what to do with right now. Anyway, for each of these threats, you will write a countdown or grim portents in Dungeon World, and you'll say what will happen if the PCs never showed up. In Dungeon World, that's called the impending doom. So let's do the genuine internal enemy real quick as an example. We're going to say it's a witch, and I'm going to have the witch threat intersect with the unfortunate holy man NPC. Okay. So here's my countdown. The witch arrives on the scene in the guise of an advisor to the local potentate. Maybe it's the Zamindar who's sheltering refugees. Maybe it's not. Maybe it's a different one. The witch convinces the potentate that the unfortunate holy man, who, again, would have a proper name if we were doing this for real. The witch convinces the potentate that the unfortunate holy man is secretly practicing witchcraft. The unfortunate holy man is put to death. The witch begins circulating rumors that the local potentate may be dabbling in witchcraft. The local potentate is whisked away by the mob. The impending doom, the witch takes over the polity. So that's just an example of how you could spin out one of those more menacing characters into an actual DW threat. Now, earlier, I put some pins in things. Yes, let's go to my pins. So I put some pins in things, and that's because we need to address what I'm going to call my secret sauce to making an adapted situation like this work, okay? Especially when you don't have a lot of sessions to sort of develop the story. That is establishing questions, all right? Establishing questions are the glue that will sort of bind your characters to the situation. The key is to use establishing questions that tie the PCs into the aforementioned cast or the circumstances, right? For example, the Zamindar who is sheltering refugees once saved your life as well. What were the circumstances? Your friend who is part of the heretical sect, you used to have a close, intimate relationship with them. What was the nature of that relationship? Why did it go south? As you enter the city, you see a crowd watching an execution. That's one of our little things from the issue, right? You see a crowd watching an execution. You recognize someone in the crowd. Who is it? Why have you come to speak to them? The rabble-rouser has a dark secret very few people know about, and you are one of those people. What is that secret? So you can see how, with those establishing questions and the answers that you get from the PCs, that will give you a chance to go back and write stakes questions that make a little bit more sense based off what the PCs or what the players have told you, and give the NPCs more specific motivations that more closely tie into what the PCs are up to. And so, to recap, these issues are super helpful, and the assets as well. The assets are the same thing as an issue. They're just like related to like specific places or objects in the polity, right? They're great, super helpful, super inspiring. You can take those things and spin them out into proper fronts that will work well for a PBTA style game. And I just wanted to kind of show that a little bit.
All of this is valuable prep work if you are doing the witch hunt adventure in the town, like for your next session. And it gives you more time to have crazy good ideas in the shower about what might happen with the gleeful executioner, that kind of thing. But if you're a week's travel away on a point or hex crawl, and that town is just one of 3 places the PCs might go, what, Jason, would be your kind of first rank of things you would prep if you had to divide your attention? Which would be your picks? Like, I think Impending Doom, for example, would be one of them for me. The overall thing, right?
It's a great question. So my normal method would be I would have the characters on the road to this place for whatever reason, right? And I would probably get some of the establishing questions out. I would probably get those out up front. So, for example, maybe they don't know yet that the Zamindar is sheltering refugees from the witch hunts, but we can still ask about their relationship to the Zamindar, right? So I would prep those things. I think the impending dooms are probably right. Like, what is at stake here, or what is the big picture, like terrible thing that's going to happen? I think you want to kind of know that going into it, because that's essentially like the adventure, right? Like that's what they're ultimately going to be trying to stop. And so I think you need to know that for sure. But I think ultimately though, like just some rumors and some establishing questions. I think that's where I'd start.
Yeah. Actually, I think that was one of the good things about hex crawls, is you can kind of seed in a whole bunch of establishing questions, even things that you're maybe not sure are establishing questions for anything in particular right at this moment. And then later when they become useful, there you go.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Nice.
Awesome. Let's go to Companion Adventures. Hi, listeners. I want to tell you about the newest issue of Codex, Codex Love 2. It's a sequel to the original Codex Love, and it has a lot of really fantastic features, including The Final Girl, a game of love, a hack of the classic horror movie game The Final Girl, but for reality dating shows like The Bachelor and Flavor of Love. And Then They Met, an original 2-player story game about a couple destined to fall in love, but that takes place entirely in the weeks and days leading up to the first time they lay eyes on each other. Willow Bluff, a queer-themed town for the classic game Dogs in the Vineyard. The newest Gauntlet daddy, Sir Barrack, and his lovely companion, Gwyn. 3 dozen men who need to be rescued. 7 original illustrations. And a custom layout by Ollie Jeffrey, whose work was recently seen in the smash hit Legacy 2E. To get Codex Love 2, just make a $4 or higher pledge on the Gauntlet Patreon by April 30th. That's at patreon.com/Gauntlet. And don't forget, Codex back issues are now available on Drive-Thru RPG. Thanks. It's the Companion Adventures. I'll start. My first one's kind of lame in a way because I'm just refining one of my choices from last time. So last time I talked about the overtone singing, the Tuvan throat singers, and I actually found a really nice YouTube video of some Tuvan throat singers that is 2 hours long.
Hey.
But it's 2 hours long, and what's really nice about it is it doesn't have a lot of like background accompaniment, and it's not super distracting. It's a little bit more meditative almost. And so I think it would make perfect background music for your session, just kind of on and quietly in the background. I don't normally love background music in sessions, but this I think would be just subtle enough to kind of help get you in the headspace. To recap what I said last episode, or for the last Yoon-Suin episode, the Tuvan throat singing to me just sounds like the mountains of the moon, right? It just sounds like some of these places, these more rural places. So yeah, that's what my first one.
Okay, I've got a film to offer, which came out in 2015. It's called Gang Rinpoche, actually, it doesn't matter what the Mandarin title of that film is because it's about Tibet, so never mind. But in English, I believe it's called Paths of the Soul, and this is good for, I would say, just getting just images of the landscape. It's about a bunch of villagers who go on a pilgrimage for 1,200 miles to Lhasa, with the added complication that, of course, a Buddhist pilgrimage of this kind involves prostrating yourself every however many steps. Anyway, there's a lot of kind of lying down and putting your head on the ground and then getting up again. So it takes a while. And just really stunning vistas, and the plotline and story is fine, but mainly it's the landscape.
I have a film choice as well. It's a documentary called Last Train Home, and it was released in 2015, and it's about the sort of annual migration, I guess, for lack of a better word, of people who work in big cities in China going back home to their like rural villages and rural provinces during New Year's, right? And that sort of like mass of people, who leave the cities to go back to their rural, hometowns. And the reason why I've selected it is because earlier you might recall I said that one of the things I found very appealing about this portion of the Yoon-Suin book is this tension between like urban and rural life. And I think this movie does a great job of just exploring the theme of that tension, right? In addition, kind of like Tom's selection, it has a lot of just really great rural, pastoral, kind of farming type imagery and scenery. And it's just a good movie too. Like the movie's just really good. It's very sad. Like you will cry a lot, because the basic sort of, dramatic conflict in the movie is it's like this couple who basically has to leave their family behind every year. They only get to come back for this like small window of time during the New Year's holiday, and just the emotion of all that and stuff. It's pretty intense, but yeah, it's a great movie.
Oh, that's just reminded me actually of a film that was massive in China about, I think, 2005-ish with Andy Lau and Fan Bingbing, which is also about the train journey going home, but in this case from somewhere in Tibet to kind of central China, called Tianxia Wuzi, World Without Thieves in English, which is, also set on a long train. And there's like, basically this guy is a bit of a naive idiot and he's carrying all of his pay on his body. And he announces that fact at the station on the way out because he thinks no one will rob him. And anyway, that's the story. I also have a book to recommend. It's called In Search of Shangri-La by Michael McCrae. And it's a little dry, to be honest. It's mainly about people exploring, mostly white people, to be honest, exploring Tibet from the kind of 19th century up until the 1990s, and possibly beyond. I haven't actually quite finished it yet. But I think it's particularly good because it has what I consider is an interesting adventuring party. On page 107, this is about a team trying to be the first ones to go through this unmapped gorge in the Pemako region, which is kind of a semi-mythical Tibetan Buddhist, either paradise or place of untamed wildness. And the party includes a 12-year-old boy and his mother from Minneapolis, an overweight Tucson property manager who had a prosthetic knee ligament, a land developer who had never slept in a tent before, and a 67-year-old wildlife cinematographer from Alaska who'd cashed in his life insurance policy to make a film about the gorge. Surprisingly, the 12-year-old kid turns out to be a bit of a hero of the expedition. So, yes, that's got to be OSR inspiration, if nothing else.
Cinematographer's your bard, right? So
yeah, definitely.
Awesome. Well, listeners, that's our show. We hope you enjoyed part 2 of Yoon-Suin. If you'd like to get in touch with us, I recommend going to Twitter and tweeting at The Gauntlet, which is also me, at Gauntlet RPG. It is both my personal Twitter and the Gauntlet Twitter. I know it's confusing. I'm sorry. We're also on G+. Just go to the community section of G+, and search for The Gauntlet. You will find us there. We have a website. It's gauntlet-rpg.com. And we are on Patreon. It's patreon.com/gauntlet. Tom, thanks so much.
Thank you, Jason.
Thanks, listeners. Take care.
Oh, Jason, but before we go, I just sort of had a thing I wanted... If you remember, we talked a bit about maybe getting a jingle for some of the segments.
Did we?
So I know we had someone submit one for Chain Lightning before. We thought it was a bit direct, a bit macho, you know. So I've been working on something. I'll just play it in for you now, and you can let me know what you think. Chain Lightning, Chain Lightning, chain. Really hope I make that saving throw.
Oh my God, what are we doing?
I think the Bowie estate's usually pretty relaxed about this kind of thing, right?
Wow, I hate you.